I logged the temperature of the air 3 times in the first hour. Not because it mattered. Because my hands needed inactivity with plausible professional justification after Corporal Renko turned to Private First Class Voss in the middle of Sector Checkpoint 2, a designated high-alert corridor, prior contact zone, 2 recorded skirmishes in the last 8 cycles, and said, in a voice barely above breath, 2. Maybe 3. She didn't look at him. Eyes forward, rifle angled toward the broken structure line to the east, scanning pattern continuous and professional and entirely unbothered. At least 3, she said. I want the middle one to have your nose. Log, I murmured into the recording device clipped to my shoulder strap, are you getting this? I need external confirmation that my systems are functioning, because I am experiencing significant difficulty resolving what I am currently observing. My name is Subcommander Vreth. 7th Monitoring Division, Korath Oversight Bureau. 11 years of field observation. 4,112 patrol reports, each filed correctly, each commended or silently accepted by a supervisory chain that has never once sent one back with the note, this reads like you've had a breakdown, please clarify. That record was about to end. My assignment, Non-Interventionary Cultural Compliance Observation, Forward Patrol Unit, Vareth 7 Sector, Mixed Species Deployment. For human operatives plus myself, who was to be invisible, quiet, and professionally unremarkable. My orders were exact: do not interfere, do not engage, do not let them feel watched. I was watching with the full intensity of a being whose career depended on it, and I was failing to understand what I was watching. Sector Vareth 7 was what my species would classify as aesthetically hostile. The sky ran a flat, heatless gray from horizon to horizon, not weather so much as the sky's general position on the terrain beneath it. The ground was pale compacted stone scattered with pre-conflict structure remnants, walls without roofs, roofs without walls, the occasional outline of something that had once been a road before something else had a strong public disagreement with it. The air smelled of cool char, dry rock, and something sweet metallic I had not yet identified. I had filed it under unknown organic compound, non-threatening, curious. The curious was not a standard classification. I had added it anyway. The humans moved through all of it without apparent aesthetic opinion. Corporal Dax Renko moved through it like he'd been designed for it. That is not metaphor, that is as close to accurate physical description as I can manage. 211 centimeters of assembled military function in a human-shaped container, and yet somehow none of that translated as threat the way I expected it to. He looked, and I wrote this in my log on day 1, crossed it out, wrote it again, left it inevitable. Not dangerous. Inevitable. The way a large body of water is not dangerous until the moment it decides to be, and the decision is never announced. He had a habit I had already catalogued, going completely still just before he moved. Not hesitation. Not processing delay. Something with interior pressure to it. A river going flat right before the current accelerates. PFC Sarah Voss was the opposing theorem. Where Renko was stillness, Voss was continuous minor motion. Weight shifts. The fingers of her left hand maintained a soft, persistent percussion against the grip of her weapon, a rhythm I had initially tagged as stress indicator, then retagged as rhythmic self-regulation, then, finally, logged as simply Voss' characteristic behavior, function unclear, not a data artifact, leave it. She was also, apparently, building a family in the margins of active patrol. I had been assigned to this unit 6 days ago. The first hypothetical children conversation occurred in the second hour. I had assumed anomaly. By my current count, the pattern had recurred 17 times across 6 days, and I had reclassified it from behavioral anomaly to recurring non-tactical communication to simply pattern, ongoing because my system had run out of appropriate categories. We moved through checkpoint 2 without incident. I kept my position, regulation 3 meters behind the human operatives, and tried to be the kind of entity that does not attract attention from things with weapons. At 0748, the patrol paused at the first structure cluster. Renko dropped into a crouch at the east wall, examining a scorch pattern I had catalogued 17 minutes earlier as environmental residue, non-recent, no tactical value. He studied it for 90 seconds. Northeast origin, I had logged at 0722. The correct conclusion. I had confirmed it against baseline reference materials. South, said Voss, without being asked. I looked at my log entry. I looked at the wall. Renko tilted his head. Looked at the fan pattern of the charring, the direction of scatter, the angle of debris displacement around the base. South, he agreed. I quietly revised my entry. Burn origin, south of observed position. This was the second time in under an hour that a human had extracted information from a physical environment I had reviewed and filed as non-informative. I added a note: do not file environments as non-informative. Human information extraction from physical residues significantly exceeds current calibration parameters. It was not the most comfortable thing I had ever written about my own competence. Voss resumed her percussion. Renko stood. She'll be like you, he said, moving to the next bearing. It took me 1.3 seconds to reorient to the conversation that had resumed without announcement. Which one? Whichever one has your instincts. They'll all have my instincts. Your nose, my instincts, your stubbornness. What does that leave for you? I'll be the one who's always right. You're already the one who's always right. Practice, she said. I logged 0750. Exchange resumed. Offspring discussion, trait inheritance, relational dynamic assessment. Non-threatening. Non-tactical. Pattern continues. What I was failing to resolve, what was generating a low-level disruption I could not clear, was the performance correlation. This was the thing that confounded me. The conversation should have been compromising attention. By every training framework I had been issued, soldiers engaging in personal conversation during live patrol were diverting cognitive resources from the threat environment. This was not philosophical. This was documented operational risk. Renko's threat assessments were not deteriorating. His scan patterns were not shortening. His response latency was not extending. When the contact probable stimulus arrived at 0811, a sound from the collapsed northeast structure, non-conclusive but worth treating as conclusive, his response time from stimulus to position was 0.3 standard seconds. The conversation did not stop. It paused. The way music pauses when the playback skips, the data still present, just briefly not playing. He moved to the structure edge without instruction. Voss flanked left without instruction. I took my position and held still and observed two people become a thing that operated without needing to communicate how. The sound resolved. Scavenger bird, local taxonomy, heat displaced, redistributing across debris. Renko's shoulders released 2 centimeters. He turned back. She'll hate early mornings, he said. Voss kept her eyes on the structure interior for 4 additional seconds before she answered. All 3 of them will hate early mornings. That's your fault. I get up early. Under protest. Protest is still up. I logged 0813. Post-alert recovery, 2 seconds. Conversation immediately resumed. Revising initial distraction classification. I do not have the correct classification. Ongoing. The admission felt unprofessional. I left it in. At 0827, with the 4th structure cluster visible at 200 meters, Renko stopped. Not a tactical stop. Not a response to any stimulus I could identify. He stopped in the middle of a clear approach and went still for 6 full seconds with his eyes on the middle distance. Then, he said, not to Voss, not into his calm, possibly to the air or possibly to some internal architecture I did not have access to, back wall. Northeast corner. Voss looked. Adjusted her bearing by 15 degrees without verbal confirmation. The northeast corner contained compressed debris, scorch residue, a secondary scatter of glass. No contact. No threat indicator. He knelt at the edge of the ash pattern and placed 2 fingers on the floor. 11 seconds. 2 days ago, he said. He stood. Rolled his shoulder. Moved on. I was still processing. still trying to determine what information he had extracted, from which physical element, at what point during the preceding 12 minutes of walking and discussing the behavioral characteristics of hypothetical children. I logged 0828. Renko identified secondary disturbance, northeast 4th structure. No current contact. Prior presence estimated 48 hours. Method of identification, unconfirmed. I did not observe the moment of identification. I paused. Then, I added, I am not sure I am watching closely enough. We reached checkpoint 3 at 0842. The structure here was old, pre-conflict, decorative once, now just the geometry of a door without anything it had ever opened to. A shape made of former intention. Renko stopped at the threshold. He didn't enter. Didn't crouch. Didn't extract. Just looked. Voss moved up beside him. 30 seconds passed without communication I could detect. Her percussion had stopped. His hands hung loose. The air in the narrow gap between them had a quality I attempted to log 4 times and deleted each time. Mass proximity effect. That was as close as I could get. Then, she said, very quiet, like she was describing something that already existed somewhere, south-facing windows. 3 bedrooms. The middle one gets the afternoon light. He was quiet. Wood floors, he said. She nodded once. I stood 3 meters behind them with my log open and my cursor blinking. I wrote 0843. Non-tactical pause. Duration 35 seconds. No action taken. I did not write what I had actually observed. My species values precision. We are trained on the belief that clarity is a form of loyalty to fact, to rank, to function. What cannot be named cannot be analyzed. What cannot be analyzed cannot be filed. I had been watching these humans for 6 days. I was beginning to understand that my filing system had a significant gap. The gap was shaped, roughly, like 2 people looking at a broken door and seeing something that hadn't been destroyed yet. Renko rolled his shoulder. Moved on. Voss' fingers resumed their percussion. 0843 hours. Sector Verith 7. 4th checkpoint bearing. Temperature unchanged. I logged the temperature again. My hands needed something to do. There is a Korath operational principle I learned in the 3rd cycle of compliance training. It states, in the formal register, a soldier whose primary loyalty object enters the field of engagement becomes a soldier whose tactical cognition is compromised. Primary loyalty object. I have been turning that phrase over for 3 hours. We entered the Keshri facility at 2114 local time, which is to say, dark. The structure had been an industrial processing plant before it stopped being that and became, in the subsequent conflict cycles, a location of alternating occupation and abandonment, the kind of building that accumulates history the way abandoned buildings do, in layers of scorched evidence and displaced debris and smells that have no current source. Our intelligence, which Renko had described at the pre-entry briefing as the part where someone guesses and we trust them, which I had logged as an interesting institutional critique, indicated probable unauthorized presence in the lower 2 levels. Probable. An interesting word to build 4 lives on. Voss had been quiet for 40 minutes before we reached the facility threshold. Not the absence of conversation quiet. A different frequency. Her percussion had stopped. Her weight shifts were slower, more deliberate, recalibrated. Something in her posture had reorganized itself into a configuration I had not observed in the prior 6 days, and I spent the first 10 minutes cataloging it before I identified the mechanism correctly. She was running calculations. Not operational calculations, not the kind I could follow or cross-reference. The kind that happens entirely behind the face, in the specific interior register of a person deciding something they have decided before and are deciding again, just to confirm the answer hasn't changed. The answer, apparently, had not changed. She arrived at the facility threshold with the cut on her forearm covered in field dressing and her rifle in the correct carrying position and whatever she had been calculating resolved and settled behind her eyes. Renko conducted the entry brief with Corporal Fesh, a compact human who communicated in monosyllables and appeared to require nothing from anyone in his environment. This suited me. One incomprehensible human per unit was the maximum I could effectively log. The plan, Renko and Voss through the northeast axis. Fesh and PFC Doran through the west. I was assigned to Renko's element, which I had begun to suspect was not a randomized assignment. Renko, I was increasingly certain, had been told to let me think I was observing. If true, that was both a minor professional insult and an extremely competent strategic decision, and I found myself unable to decide which of those two things occupied me more. We entered at 21:14. The facility interior smelled of standing water, oxidized metal, and the sweet metallic compound I had been cataloging since Patrol 1. In this enclosed space, without the outdoor dispersal, it was heavier. I filed it again under unknown organic compound, non-threatening, and added persistent to the description because I was beginning to think it would follow me home. Renko moved differently indoors. That was the first adjustment I noted. The stillness before movement quality had changed into something more continuous, a distributed, omnidirectional attention that had no observable starting point and no observable end. He was not scanning in arcs the way I had been trained to scan. He was doing something simultaneously and all at once that I could not replicate and could barely observe the edges of. Like the building was speaking and he was listening to the whole sentence at once instead of word by word. Voss was 1.5 meters to his left. She had not resumed her percussion since the 40-minute quiet before entry. Whatever calculation she had completed, it had taken her to a different operational frequency still, but not the stillness of inactivity. The stillness of something that has finished preparation and is now simply ready. At 21:27, the floor plan required a temporary split. A collapsed inner wall had created two parallel corridors leading to the same convergence point, 30 meters ahead. Standard procedure: separate, converge at the junction. Renko looked at Voss. She looked back. No words. No hand signal from any protocol I recognized. He went right. She went left. I followed Renko because those were my instructions and because the left corridor contained significantly more standing water, and I had concerns about my recording equipment that I am not proud of in retrospect. 22 meters into the right corridor, something fell in the left corridor. It was not a large sound. A structural shift. Debris displacement. I logged it at 21:31 and maintained forward movement, because that was the correct professional response to an ambiguous sound in a facility with confirmed structural instability. Renko stopped. Not a tactical stop. Not a decision based on observable threat data. The kind of stop that happens when something bypasses the professional layer entirely and grabs something underneath it. He was still for 4 seconds. I counted. In those 4 seconds, his right hand moved 3 centimeters toward the wall, a reaching that didn't reach, a touch withheld, and the thing I had been failing to correctly classify for 6 days surfaced clearly enough to see. He was not divided between duty and something that competed with duty. He was carrying both simultaneously in the same muscle, and both had weight, and neither was going to yield, and the only question was what happened in the moment between them. He moved left. Not abandoning the mission. Not deviating recklessly. He moved with the same distributed efficiency he had applied to every corridor tonight, and I fell behind because I was trying to process and log at the same time, and I am noting here for the record that these two activities have become increasingly incompatible over the course of 7 days. Voss was at the corridor junction. Standing. A secondary ceiling section had displaced manageable, non-structural, and she had a 2-centimeter cut on her left forearm that she was not treating with any visible urgency. Renko reached her in 11 seconds. He did not touch her. He looked at her face first. Then, the arm. Then, the corridor behind her. Then, her face again. The sequence. Always the sequence. Face, injury, position, face. She held up the arm with the patience of someone who has participated in this exact exchange before and finds it more reassuring than irritating. Debris, she said. Yes, he said. I'm fine. Yes, he said again. He turned back to the original bearing. She fell into step beside him, and I logged at 2131, 2132, 2133, cycling through fields looking for the right one, and, finally, wrote, Renko deviated to secondary corridor upon hearing unidentified sound. Cause, debris fall, no hostile contact. VOS, minor laceration, non-incapacitating. Deviation duration, approximately 90 seconds. Mission impact, minimal. Then, I added, the deviation was not a tactical error. I deleted it. I wrote it back in. In professional documents, the lines you keep deleting and reinserting are usually the truest lines. The Eastern cluster took another 40 minutes. I will not catalog each beat of it, the operational record exists in the primary report filed at 1352, but I will catalog, here, the thing that happened at 1041 in the cluster's furthest interior, because it is the thing this document is actually about. We found what the intelligence had labeled as probable unauthorized presence. It was not abandoned. It was brief. It was resolved. Everyone who was supposed to come back came back. In the 0.7 second window between resolution and aftermath, Voss placed her right hand, the one with the new cut, briefly on Renko's forearm. Not long. Not with visible emotion. A contact. A physical confirmation of the most basic arithmetic, I'm here. You're here. The sum holds. He didn't look at her. He was already moving to the next position. His arm, where she had touched it, moved differently for approximately 40 seconds. A micro-adjustment in the shoulder carry. A slight redistribution of the tension. I logged it at 10:43, brief physical confirmation of shared status. Duration, approximately 2 seconds. Effect on subsequent behavior, 40 seconds of observable change. Significance, I stopped. I deleted significance, unclear. I wrote, I know what it means. I just don't have the file for it yet. At 2147, the lower levels were confirmed empty. No current presence. Signs of recent occupation, compressed debris for seating, heat residue consistent with a low fire, the sweet metallic smell at its strongest near the northeast wall, but the occupants had been absent for 6 to 18 hours by Renko's read of the ash pattern, completed in 40 seconds, matching my own analysis to within acceptable margin. I noticed this. I was getting better at not being surprised. Renko walked the room's perimeter while Voss documented physical evidence. 12 steps along the first wall. 7 along the irregular second wall where structural failure had altered the original floor plan. 5 along the third. He was not conducting a standard evidence survey, he was doing the thing again, the thing where the corners held more information than the walls, where the spaces between things were the things he was actually reading. At the northern end of the room, he crouched at the edge of the ash pile and placed 2 fingers on the floor. 11 seconds. The same duration as the fourth structure cluster. 2 people, he said. Maybe 3. Eating. Not sleeping. Transient, Voss said. Useful to someone. Or hiding from someone. He looked at his fingers on the floor. Both, maybe. I was logging this and simultaneously trying to identify what I was actually watching. My species is trained in evidence synthesis. Every Korath intelligence operative learns pattern extraction, residue reading, probability reconstruction. These are documented procedures with sequential steps and assessment rubrics. What Renko was doing had no steps. It was more like listening. Like the room had said something in a register I couldn't access, and he was simply letting it finish. I added to my log, human evidence reading appears to involve a processing modality I cannot replicate or observe directly. Methodology, unknown. Results, consistently accurate. Further observation suggested. Beneath further observation suggested, I had 11 previous entries in this file. I was either learning something significant or discovering the exact dimensions of what I had never known, and those two things were becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish. Renko stood in the center of the confirmed empty room and looked at the ghost of an occupation that had moved on. He looked tired. Not operational tired. Not the depletion of physical output. Something older and deeper, the kind that lives below the professional surface and only rises when the immediate demand resolves and there is nothing left to absorb into. Voss crossed the room to him. She did not take his hand. She stood beside him, close enough that their arms almost touched, looking at the same empty floor. 3, she said. Not loud. Not quite directional. The word was almost interior, the room receiving it rather than her speaking into it. He was quiet for a long moment. Yeah, he said. I did not log this exchange. I considered logging it for almost 30 seconds. I considered what field it would occupy, what category I could construct, what operational justification I could build around its inclusion in an official compliance document. I turned the recording off for 40 seconds. This was a protocol violation. I turned it back on. I did not add anything about those 40 seconds. Some things happen in the space between the logs, and the logs are not diminished for not containing them. We cleared the facility by 2200. Filed an unfulfilled contact report at 2215. I had 14 open log entries with empty fields. I left them empty. My supervisor was going to think I had malfunctioned. My supervisor was missing the point. My final patrol with Renko's unit was the 7th day. I had drafted the concluding section of my compliance report 3 times before 0600 and deleted all 3 versions. The problem was the conclusion. The body of the report was professionally complete. Dates, times, patrol routes, threat assessments, contact logs. Everything that fit in a box had been placed in its correct box, organized in the correct sequence, documented with the kind of exact impersonality that had kept my record clean for 11 years. From a regulatory standpoint, it was a perfectly adequate document. The conclusion required me to make a professional assessment. And the professional assessment required me to answer one standard question: is the unit's operational effectiveness within acceptable parameters? The correct answer was yes. The objective answer was yes. By every metric I had been given to measure against, Renko's unit performed above baseline on every recorded indicator. I had been trying to write that sentence since 0230. The difficulty was not in the conclusion. The difficulty was in everything that made the conclusion feel like the least true part of the document. Patrol 7 began at 0700, same sector bearing as Patrol 3, Verith 8 extension, elevated threat classification. Our intelligence indicated a possible coordination point in the eastern structure cluster significantly larger than anything we had operated in previously, changed occupant status 4 times in the prior cycle. Voss had the cut on her arm covered with standard field dressing. She did not mention it. It did not affect her movement. I had already filed this. What I noted and could not immediately categorize was the conversation they were not having. For the first 2 hours of Patrol 7, there were no hypothetical children. No 3 bedrooms. No south-facing windows. No futures being assembled in the margins of active patrol. They moved through the sector efficiently and without personal exchange, and I kept waiting for the pattern to resume, and it didn't, and I found this, and I am recording this at the cost of professional composure actively unsettling. I had been bothered by the pattern for 6 days. I had logged it as anomalous, recurring, structurally significant, finally, foundational to their operational dynamic in a way I was still unable to articulate correctly. And, when the pattern was absent, I was bothered by its absence. This is what I mean when I say the conclusion was insufficient. The Eastern Structure Cluster at 0847. Third Interior. Voss went through a floor. Not completely. Not fatally. The secondary level had been progressively compromised by water damage. A section approximately 1 meter by 80 centimeters gave way beneath her, and she dropped to the lower level, roughly 2 meters, and, by the time I registered the sound and looked, Renko was already at the edge of the breach and Fesh was on the perimeter and Doran was covering the approach corridor and I was standing in the middle of all of this trying to determine my threat assessment, which I will admit was My primary cognitive activity in that moment, and which I am recording accurately despite how it reflects on me. Voss' voice came up from below. I'm down. I'm fine. Stand by. She did not sound distressed. She sounded professionally inconvenienced. Renko was at the edge of the breach and something happened in his face that I had been building toward logging for 7 days and still could not locate the correct feel for. It was not fear. It was something that had been underneath everything I had observed, underneath the wall-like presence, the distributed attention, the stillness before movement, and it surfaced for 2.3 seconds and then went back under. The way a current shows itself at the surface and then disappears, and you understand it is still there because the water is moving differently. Can you move? He said. Give me 4 seconds, she said. He gave her 4 seconds. He was not still during those 4 seconds. His hands were in motion, a small, contained movement at his sides that I recognized from Voss's percussion and that I now understood, finally, correctly, as the thing you do when you are holding something stable that has no physical form to hold. Moving, she said. She came through the adjacent doorway 40 seconds later with structural debris in her hair, a second small cut on her right hand, and her rifle in the correct operational position. The debris in her hair she didn't acknowledge. The cut she did not look at. Renko looked at her. Face. Injury. Position. Face. The sequence. The same sequence. Every time. She raised her eyebrows at him, small, minimal, efficient. Gestured at the structure and the eastern approach and the bearing ahead, your call. He looked at the mission bearing. At the objective, approximately 230 meters east. At the intelligence they had been sent to confirm or deny. He looked at her hand. The cut. The new one. The small red fact of it. Forward, he said. She nodded. They moved. I logged 0849. PFC Voss, floor breach, lower level drop, self-recovered. Minor laceration, right hand. Mission continued. Then, I stopped. Stood in the structure interior. Looked at the hole in the floor. 4 seconds. The hands moving. Forward. I did not finish the log entry for a while. My species has a word. I am going to write it here in the Korath register and, then, attempt a translation, Velkov. In operational terminology it means, roughly, sustained function under competing obligations. The military application is closer to continuing to perform when the performance costs you something real, and continuing anyway, not because the cost doesn't register, but because you have decided what the cost is for. That is the best I can do with translation. What I had been observing for 7 days was not a soldier divided. That was the first thing I had gotten wrong, and it was the thing every entry in my log had been built around, and it was incorrect in a way that made most of the log incorrect by association. Divided implies a split. 2 things pulling at a single point until it gives. A structural failure of competing forces. That is not what Renko was. The eastern structure cluster took another 80 minutes to clear fully. At 10:41, in the furthest interior, we confirmed what the intelligence had labeled a coordination point. It was not empty this time. I am not going to detail the contact. It was brief. It was resolved. Everyone who was supposed to come back came back, and that sentence contains more than it appears to contain, and I am leaving it there. What I am going to detail is the window that opened at 10:43, after resolution and, before the next movement, a specific quality of air I had first encountered at a ruined doorway on day 1, settling back over Renko and Voss with a density I had not observed in any of the prior 6 days. The way the same light looks different after a storm. Voss put her right hand, the one with the new cut, briefly on his forearm. Not long. Not demonstrative. A contact. A confirmation. The most basic arithmetic, here. Here. The sum holds. He didn't look at her. He was already moving. But, his arm, where she had touched it, moved differently for approximately 40 seconds. A micro-adjustment in the shoulder. A slight change in how the tension distributed itself. I had been watching this man for 7 days and I knew the difference between how he moved and how he moved after she touched him, and the difference was not large, but it was consistent, and it was real, and I logged it at 10:43 and sat with the cursor blinking in the significance field for a long time before I typed, I know what it means. I just don't have the file for it yet. We completed the patrol at 1200. Confirmed abandoned, again. Renko received this information with the specific resignation of someone who has recalibrated their relationship with institutional prediction. At the return point, while Fesh and Doran filed their operational summaries, Voss sat on a low-structure remnant and cleaned her rifle with the meticulous care of someone performing a practiced prayer. Renko stood beside her, not sitting, watching the eastern bearing they had just come from. 3 minutes passed. She said, without looking up from the rifle, 4. He was quiet. I changed my mind, she said. 4. He looked at the eastern bearing for another moment. Then, he looked down at her. 4 is a lot of south-facing windows, he said. We'll build them bigger. A pause. Okay, he said. I finished the compliance report at 13:47. I answered yes to the question about operational effectiveness. I filed every box I could fill and left the others technically empty while being substantively complete, which my supervisor would flag and which I had decided I was prepared to defend. In the summary field, I wrote, Unit demonstrates above baseline performance across all measured indicators. Methodology for observed performance consistency partially understood. Further observation recommended. The last 3 words were the most honest sentence in the document. I submitted it at 13:52. Then, I sat with the log running and said nothing into it for 4 minutes. 4 minutes. In 11 years of field observation, that had not happened before. Log, I said, eventually. I think I have been measuring the wrong things. I was not sure what the right things were. That was an uncomfortable position for a sub-commander with 11 years and a clean commendation record, sitting at the end of a standard patrol cycle in a sector of no particular strategic significance. But I knew this. He was not torn. That was the central error in my original assessment and every assessment that followed it. The error I had been building on for 7 days, stacking log entry on a foundation that was wrong. Torn implies fracture. Competing forces degrading a single structure. A soldier whose attention is divided is a soldier who is less. That is not what I watched. What I watched was a man who had made a decision at some point before I arrived, in some moment I was not present for and will never observe that the future was not separate from the present. That the children with his nose and her instincts were not a distraction from the war. They were the reason the war had a direction. They were the point to which the direction pointed. She wasn't whispering about their children because she was distracted. She was maintaining bearing. Every time she said 3 bedrooms or south-facing windows or 4, she was saying, there is a reason we are going forward. There is a reason the word forward means something. There is a place where this ends and something else begins and we have agreed on what it looks like, and as long as we are still agreeing on what it looks like, we are still moving toward it. And he was, every time, confirming, yes. I know. Forward. The percussion on the rifle grip wasn't stress. It was a count. I have 4,113 patrol reports now. This is the only one I'm going to read again. Not because it's the most complete. It is the least complete. It has more empty fields than any document I have ever submitted. Because it is the first one that knew it was missing something and said so. My supervisor will probably flag it. My supervisor will probably write me a note about the empty fields and the personal addendum and the entry that just reads I know what it means. I just don't have the file for it yet. I'll write back. I'll tell her, I'm working on it. And then, I will request reassignment to the same unit for the next patrol cycle. Because I think they're only getting started. And I think I've only just learned how to watch.